Okay, right, hello and welcome back to another video. So I hope everyone had a good break over the festive season, but now back to it here in January. Today we're going to be having a look at this roots animation. So this is a root growing shader effect. It works well for anything sort of cylindrical that's growing, so roots, tentacles, that kind of thing. Really nice shader and mesh technique. It's completely static, so this is just a static model with the shader applied and then a parameter animating. So it works really well for cinematics and those kinds of one-off things. Something that was sort of a more combat effect, if this was a spell that cast this, you wanted to be more dynamic, you might want to do a bit more to this. But a few different techniques you can use for this. You could set up a blueprint spline, all of those kind of things if you wanted it to be editable in Engine. But we're going to do it the really simple way. Just start with a model, import, and then animate this shader. Cool. So I've done this a few times for various things, but would be remiss of me not to mention this great breakdown by Gil Damoiseau. I think I'm pronouncing that right, but apologies if not. This is the technique we're going to be using basically. So cylinder with UVs laid out, and then we're just going to animate along those UVs, and we're going to move the texture, we're going to move some well position offsets, and then we're going to use that to shrink our verts down, and we can create this kind of growing effect. So do check out their work. They've got some great breakdowns and stuff on their Twitter and things. Okay, so if we jump over to Maya, I'm working Maya. I'm sure Blender has similar tools. I don't use Blender, I apologize if you do. But what we're going to do is we're going to use a feature called Make Live. So if I select here my target geometry, so I've got the floor and the column. If I make these live, you see the wireframe goes green. Now when I click, it's going to snap to that surface, which is a really nice way to kind of draw things around. So if I go to Create, Curve, and EP Curve, if I click a few times here on the floor, and then I can sort of snap upwards. Just be careful you're not snapping through, but there we go. Makes it a little bit easier to kind of come around and curve around the column. Probably haven't put enough points in that, but you can see the idea. Obviously you can spend a bit longer on your curves than I have on mine. Cool. Turn off Make Live. If we want to have this overlapping, we're going to have to sort of spend some time really fiddling with that. Maybe you draw one, extrude, draw another, use that previous one as a live surface, all of that kind of stuff to kind of build up this network, as it were, of curves. And then what I'm going to do is take a cylinder and extrude that along the path. So if I make a cylinder, now I want this to be a very fixed radius. So I'm going to use a radius of 5. It doesn't really matter what it is. We can use the tools in the shader to extend that later on. But we want it to be a fixed number that we remember, because we're going to use that as part of our shader. Cool. Let's go to these faces, center that, snap it down. Oops. Snap it down. There we go. And actually, we want it to be over here at the center of our curve. So if I just curve snap that, curve snap's really crap. There we go. What we want is to align this with our curve. Something like that. And I should now be able to select the faces, select the curve, and because I've selected faces and then curve, when I do an extrude, it's going to use that curve as a path for the extrusion. Doesn't look very curvy. What's gone wrong? Well, we don't have any geometry to do the bending. So in divisions, if we just up this to a decent number, something like 50, we can see if we put that down to, like, I don't know, 5, you're going to get the geometry conforming to the curve, but we need quite a few edge loops to create a nice smooth curve. Now we are going to use some noise to sort of push this out again later, so I'm going to aim a bit higher than this, maybe a bit too high. My initial cylinder was probably a bit too high. I wonder, is Maya going to let me go back and use the history? No. Unfortunately, Maya's history not very good, but we'll just work with some high-res geometry for now. We'll call this a cinematic effect and make sure we've got nice amounts of geometry. Something like that. Okay, so we are getting a bit of clipping here. You can see we could have tweaked that before we did our extrusion. It is still live, so if we select our curve, control vertex, we should be able to just move this around and it will update the geometry with it. It's a bit fiddly, you can't really see what you're editing, so it's a bit tricky sometimes. Maybe there's better ways to do this. Anyway, not going to sit here and fiddle this while you watch. That's how I've made these curves. We don't need end caps, so I deleted those faces, but we do need the UVs laid out in a very specific way. So if I select the model here, a bit difficult to see because they're overlapping, but if I select some of the vertices at the top, you can see I've laid them out, effectively unwrapped longwise, one cut along the bottom. So you then unfold the cylinder, and then the top at the top and the bottom at the bottom. And that's going to allow us to have a nice gradient along this. And if I just look at the shaded mode, I actually have a gradient on here. So I've just assigned a quick gradient texture. Well, it's not a texture actually, it's a ramp in here. That's the wrong shader. That's 'cause I've got the wrong thing selected. There we go. Number 2. So we've got a ramp shader in here, and you can kind of see the effect that we're going to be using. So here I've just pushed that ramp down so it's only a tiny little bit of white at one end. As I bring that value up, you can see it's moving along the surface. Cool. So that's our UVs laid out as a cylinder, sort of top and top to bottom. And then there's a couple other bits I'm going to do, and that's vertex colors. So if I toggle the display vertex colors attribute, a bit tricky to see, but the red channel, the last few edge loops here are painted from black to white in the red channel, which is where it goes to red. And that's going to be just a sort of fail-safe gradient that we're going to use to make sure that the end of our root stays always collapsed. And then the other channel is blue, and it's just a random value for each tentacle, and we'll use that to break up the timing in our shader. Cool. That is the making of these tubes. Hopefully that makes sense. Just draw a path, curve around your object, extrude along that path with some faces. Make sure you've got a decent amount of geometry. This is maybe a bit high, but a decent amount of geometry in order to do your world position offset that we're going to do now in the shader. Cool. So jumping over to Unreal, I'm just going to make a new material. I'm going to do this all from scratch. Okay, so we have our material. Let's make this one a different color to make it distinct from the previous. Let's do something like blue. What I'm going to do first is the world position offset part. So world position offset takes a vector input. If I were to put just a vector into it like so, I can move my verts along that vector before they start rendering. So if I wanted to go 50 units up in the air, I've now moved my object, well, I've moved the rendering of my object 50 units up in the air. This doesn't affect collision or anything like that, so it's just a visual effect, but it's a really nice way to control what's happening. And obviously we can animate it and control it with textures and materials, which is how we're going to do this effect. Now, what we just saw was moving in world space. We don't want to move in world space. Instead, we want to use the vertex normals of our model. This is why we had it as a cylinder. We didn't model any tapering or bumps or anything like that into the shape, so that it's much easier to work with it like so. So using the vertex normals, if we add a value, you can see we're going to make things sort of bump outwards. But if we take away a value, and specifically if we take away the value 5, we're going to shrink things down to basically nothing. Remember, in Maya I had a cylinder of radius 5 before I extruded, so if I take away that 5, it's going to shrink it down, not completely to nothing, but pretty small, and that's going to kind of create the tip of our effect, our tentacle, our root, whatever this is. Now, rather than just using a single parameter, I'm going to use a lerp, and I'm going to blend. And what I'm going to use to do that blend is some UVs, or a UV gradient. So if I mask out the green channel, that gives me a gradient from black to white. So where this is black, I want a value of -5. And where this is white, I want a value of 0. Now I have here where the UVs are reading that value from 1, I have white, and that's giving me this value B, 0. So I'm not getting any difference from what the imported model was. But here at the other end, at the tip, we've created a taper all the way along our effect. Obviously, we could make this bigger. If I use a bigger value, it's going to bump up. So as I said earlier, the radius that we used is good to know the value, so we can do this, but we can actually still just edit it here, so we can kind of get final control that way as well. Cool. Now we want to animate this. So what I'm going to do is create a offset value and just add that to our UV. So we're effectively moving our gradient up and down. This is what we saw with the ramp example in Maya. Now if I add values, we get an error at the top as things start to poke open. And if I subtract values, we get the animation that we want, this kind of growing of where that sort of pinch point is, but we get an error with stuff this side as well. So this is where the model's gone inside out, and we're now getting this sort of reverse normals. That's why it's black here, and we don't want to see that. Now, both relatively simple things to fix. Firstly, if I make this a masked material, already was, this isn't the first time I've done this, but there we go. If I make this a masked material, then now I can control the visibility here. And if I just use the same values, the same gradient, excuse me, there we go, same gradient values, to what's going into my lerp also goes into my opacity mask, it's going to give me a result, but it's not quite right. You can see we're not seeing anything over here anymore, but now we're getting not all the way to the point visible. So opacity masked, what it does, anything above the mask clip value, which is here, anything above that is visible, anything below that is not visible. But in our case, we wanted black and white, anything positive to be visible, anything negative to be invisible. And so here it's taking a grayscale value, and so basically this value is too high. If I set that to 0, we'll get the correct result. And now it's clipping out at the smallest point. Hopefully that makes sense. Already looking pretty cool. What else can we do? Well, if I go values over 1, it's going to pull apart these points here. Well, we could just make sure this never goes above 1 and just put a clamp on it, but then we'd never be able to get the root here any thicker. And if this is kind of like a magic growing in effect, it's going to get there first and then want to carry on growing. I do want to have this value accept greater values here, but we have a piece of data or set of data that we painted earlier. We have the vertex colors. So if you remember, the red channel is set so that it's black at the end and then very quickly becomes to white. So we can use that as a multiplier. Like so. So no matter what we do to our offset and our UVs before we get to our actual effect, we're just going to multiply by the red channel. So now it's always clamped down to nothing. And no matter what I do here, it's going to stay at 0. Now we've got a different problem, the sort of inflation. I want this to grow to a certain size, but no more. Well, that's an easy fix. This value here that goes into my lerp, that's what's doing that growing. If I clamp it, now it will never go any bigger. And so now I can move my offset. And you can see it kind of goes along, reaches the point, and then finishes. Obviously, there's some point this starts to look bad, but you can definitely push it further than you could have done before. Cool. next thing I wanted to is variation. So we used one vertex color channel, and that was the red. We have the blue channel, and the different models have different values in there. If I just take that and add the, after it's been masked, and then add the blue channel to our gradient, and I'm going to give myself a control, just a parameter for how much blue channel I want to add. Variation. Okay. So adding no variation is obviously not going to create the variation. That's fine. It's exactly as it was before. These three things are pretty aligned. But if I up the variation count, you can see that one center is going further. And you can control how much or how little variation you want. If you wanted to animate this in a cutscene, you could animate both the offset and the variation at the same time, and they'd all start at the same time, and some would grow faster and that kind of thing. So quite a lot you can do with this technique. One thing to note, if I'm adding variation, if I put that to say 0.5, my offset value now needs to go lower. So with no variation, 0, an offset of -1 will pull the whole gradient down so it's purely black, and then that will mean that everything shrunk down to nothing. But if I start adding variation, let's say 0.5, now some of this is visible, so I just need to make sure that my offset value kind of goes to the same value and corresponds with what variation I'm adding. But that's fine, it's just a value. So whatever you're adding here to create variation, you need to make sure you're also taking into account of it when you're removing your initial visibility. Cool. Let's just do a little bit of variation. All right. That's the animation shader part, or the world position offset part. Works quite well. Taking a min and max along the vertex normal, making sure the minimum shrinks to nothing, using a gradient to control that, and then also controlling the opacity mask, making sure the mask is set to opacity clip mask value set to 0. And then to animate, we add values to our UVs, and to add variation, we use a vertex color channel. Cool. So save that. Next thing we want to do is add some texture. So I'm just going to grab a quick texture file. I'm just going to use some noise, but you can use whatever you want. Obviously, you can spend a bit longer on your stuff. Actually, use some nice, I don't know, that will do, textures and what have you. And what I'm going to do is, just for argument's sake, make this visible, just for demonstration purposes. If I take that and just multiply it in and see what happens. Maybe set my offset to something like that. Now there's a couple of things happening here. Firstly, the UVs of our model are set so that the whole tentacle, if I go back to Maya, the whole tentacle is unwrapped once on the sort of x-axis and once on the y. It's all unitized into 0 to 1, but it's obviously a lot longer than it is thicker, and so our aspect ratio is very off. Now that doesn't matter, but it just means that we need to sort of take account of that in our UVs when we're texturing. So if I plug this in here, and 1 being 1 by 1, if I do 1 by 10, it's going to look wrong here, but probably look right there. So we've effectively stretched our UVs, or squashed our UVs down here, and now we're stretching our shader, and when the two things apply, we get kind of an inverse effect, one affecting the other. Might just put some roughness on this, make it, no, other way around, make it shiny, make it rough. There we go. Cool. Now this is textured. If I go to my offset and change the values, you can see the texture doesn't move with the shader, which isn't very good. That's not what we want. We want this to appear like it's growing. So if the texture moves at the same speed as the as the shader's moving, we'll get that effect. And so what I'm going to do, because I'm tiling by 10 here, I'm also going to go in and make sure that I tile by 10 in the world position offset shader. Now this is going to affect our kind of range a little bit. And now we need to go a lot further down in our offset value, but it means that when we're kind of animating these things, they're going to coincide nicely. Not sure I like the bumping outwards anymore. There we go. It has affected the curve a little bit, but it's going to make this next step much easier. Because what we want to do is we're going to take this offset value, and as well as controlling the UV gradient here, we're going to control the UV gradient here. And if we just add it in, well, we've sort of got what we want. That's the first step at least. They are twisting. Now maybe that's what you want. That's quite cool. Twisting maybe quite a lot. What's happening? Well, we're adding values to both the U and the V channel. So our texture is scrolling along our tentacle, but it's also twisting around and scrolling around as well. So all we're going to do is take our offset value, and before I add it to UV here, I'm going to append 0, because I want to add only in one of the axes. Now I think I've done this wrong, and yes I have. You can see it's twisting around. And so if I swap my append, whoops. So I'm adding to the green channel at the same time as I'm scrolling along the green channel, and there we are. You can see that the texture moves, and as the texture moves, the tentacle moves, the world position moves, and it all updates at the same time. And you get kind of a cool effect. If we wanted, we could also make this a parameter. If we were animating this in sequencer, for example, and we could call this something like twist, and then we could animate that value at the same time. Ooh, let's compile it, and now you can see we're getting that twisting. Maybe if I just take the offset and like quarter it or something. Oops, not gonna work. Yeah, so you get a little bit of twist. Probably we'd want to break that up and use some positive twist, some negative twist, and we could use the vertex color to create that kind of variation, that kind of thing. But we're not going to go into that for now. Cool. One last thing we want to do, we've got our texture moving along here, sort of for the visual texturing part of it, but these are still completely flat cylindrical shapes. If we wanted to add some bumpiness, we could do the same thing. So here we've got our vertex normals being collapsed down into world position offset. If we took our noise and let's say multiply that by oops, not spell that correctly, a value. Before we multiply by the vertex normals, we could add that in. Now this will sort of work, or at least it will work, but there'll be some issues with it. You can see as I bump this out, and we need to have a certain amount of geometry. It maybe doesn't have enough geometry, even though it's already quite high res. This effect really needs some sort of tessellated geometry. And you see we're starting to get little kind of errors there, depending where we're viewing it from. Maybe it works. As it moves along, what we're going to get is also bumping, and you can see things growing in and out, and that's because of the geometry we have. Excuse me. But a little bit, say 1, 2, something like that. A little bit can go quite a long way. And the texture we're using here, this has quite distinct blacks and whites. If I make a different texture, make sure we use the same UVs, but we do something soft, soft even distribution. That looks like a soft noise. That looks like might be what we want. And so the more soft the noise, the less of those kinds of harsh edges you're going to see. There's my offset parameter. Here we go. So you can see this kind of bumps sometimes as they go along, but because they're nicely smoothed out in the texture, they're quite soft. Oh, bit of a problem. What have we done? Well, we've lost our point because we've added values. Oops. There we go. Rotate around it properly. Simple fix though. We just want to make sure that this vertex color that we're multiplying here, let's do that later on. And let's just do it again. I can probably find a place to do this if I've refracted my code a little bit, but I can also just multiply it again. That'll do. It's probably the last thing I should do. There we go. And that should. That has not. Why has that not? Oh, it's not the vertex colors that I want to do, is it? It's the gradient. So this gradient here that goes from black to white, I want to make sure that my bumpiness doesn't apply at the tip. There we go. That's right. So whatever it's doing here possibly wants to include the vertex colors as well. So this is controlling not just the opacity and the world position offset, but also the additional world position offset that we're getting here from the bumpy texture. That makes sense. That's right. Now I can bump up whatever I like at the back, and so on. One thing as well, this is only doing additive. I might want to subtract a half. So now that we're going to get some texture where our verts move inwards and some go outwards. Well, not as much as that. Subtract it a little bit. I'm just fiddling now. The effects are there. Now it's going to be a bit more. Don't know if I like that, to be honest. But you can hopefully see what I was going for, depending on what kind of effect you want. As I say, the amount of geometry, if you look, this sort of like seesawing effect is because of the lack of geometry in these edge loops. But for a subtle effect, let's get rid of this subtract, I don't like it. But for a subtle effect, it works quite well. Okay. So, quick recap of the effect, what we're doing and how we're doing it. We have effectively three things happening. We have the initial world position offset, shrunk down to a point by knowing how wide our cylinder was. We are controlling that with an animated gradient that's just moving up and down. We have picked up the point to make sure that that edge case is fixed. We've added some variation using vertex colors. We've textured it using a texture that is tiled to compensate for the fact that our UVs were squished. And then we're making sure that the texture coordinate works in the same way, so that these two things are completely aligned. And then we're animating and offsetting that texture at the same speed as we are the world position offset. And then in this case, we've just added a little bit of additional world position offset to break up the cylindrical nature of the initial imported mesh. Cool. Pretty nice effect. Works really well for cinematics, as I say. If you wanted to do something dynamic, you could use a blueprint spline, potentially. You'd have to control how the UVs and everything worked on that, but you could set that up. It's a bit more complicated, maybe something I'll look at for a future thing at some point. But if this was sort of a magic spell, you could maybe create an array of different tentacles or roots, let's say, and so you had like 5 or 6 different setups that all work together, and you selected 3 of them at random, and so you'd get kind of a lot of variation that way, but you'd still see some repetitiveness at some point. But you can always back that up with some sort of dynamic particle effects and stuff as well. So yeah, that's the shader, that's the technique. You can do a lot with this kind of animating world position offset, but this I think is a particularly cool way of working. So yeah, cool. If you like that tutorial and you want to know more about this kind of effect, I have some courses available on Gumroad and Udemy. 4 on materials, 2 on Niagara, more coming this year. Currently we're still in January, so there is a 10% off sale, and if you check out the codes, I can't remember what codes I've used, this isn't very good, is it? If I go to my own YouTube channel, there is a video somewhere about the January sale. Welcome back to another. Codes that I've used are January sale 2024 and free materials. So the first materials course is 100% free for the rest of January, so it's the 19th today, so you've got a little bit of time to go and get that and check that out. Cool. As always, big thanks to my patrons for supporting the channel. If you want to become a patron, there is a link, you can do that, that would be great. I will be back with more tutorials both here on YouTube and more long form ones on Gumroad and Udemy coming soon. But if you have anything that you'd like to know about, please do email me, reach out, and I will see you all next time.